Curt, I'm curious about people who feel really lonely and don't feel like they can find sort of that good community that reflects their true identity back to them. What would you say to people who feel like they're in that position?
I think one of the first things that I would that I would appeal to, and this I think directly emerges out of a Christian anthropology, and that is it raises the question about teleology, like what is our purpose? What's our sense? Like, are we people who just showed up here, or are we creatures? Were we created? Were we made? And that whole notion, for instance, shapes things, because then that raises the question, well, what were we made for? And we would say that, we Christians would say, well, we were made to create and curate beauty and goodness in the world. That's what we were made to do. And if you look around, we have a really hard time doing that. We really have a hard time loving one another. We have a hard time being loved by one another. It's excruciatingly difficult to be a peacemaker. It's easy to commit violence. Excruciatingly difficult to make peace. Keeping peace isn't even the same thing, but making peace. So, for instance, then we get to places where when people are asking the question that you're offering, it presumes that I could give them an answer that they themselves would carry out and resolve that. And what I would invite them to consider is that nobody creates purpose all by themselves in an isolated chamber. I'm responding to something else that's going on in my world, in the same way that newborns and infants and toddlers don't find purpose all by themselves. It is something that they receive as part of being a community in the first place. And so I would be asking questions like, who are the people? Give me the names of 3 people, if you could, by whom you could say, if I were to talk to each of them together, there would be nothing about you that they don't know. Who are those people? And they might say, well, I don't have people like that in my life. Where can I find them? And I would say these are relationships that we're going to need to make together. That my resolving my problem with loneliness is not a problem that I solve, it is a problem that we solve. It is because I'm going to make the assumption that for my brain, in order for it to flourish, it can't figure out the question of flourishing by itself. I'm going to need to have the presence of other people in the room because, in fact, when you look at whether you get God involved in this conversation or not, when you look at attachment research, you see that those children that grow up in places where they have secure attachment that develops, their brains, their middle prefrontal cortices are far more integrated in terms of the 9 different functions that the middle prefrontal cortex carries out. They're far more able to do this by the time they're 6 and 8 and 10 years of age when they have secure attachment. That's not just about what that single individual child is doing. That's about what is happening with them in the context of a community. That kind of life doesn't change when you're 20 or when you're 80. My deep need for connection with other people is part of how I'm going to allow them to ask me the kinds of questions that will enable my sense of purpose to emerge. Not unlike the conversation that you have in your boat with your daughter that evokes something for you that changes the direction of how you're telling that story in the first place. And this is what's really challenging when we live in a world that has for 500 years been training us to believe that we, each of us as individuals, should be able to come into the world and be able to be master of my universe without the help of anybody else. I should be able to pull myself up by my own bootstraps. And the reality is that human beings simply don't survive in that kind of a context.